afternoon. Today we're really excited of having Philip Martin and Agustín Escobar Latapí here at Colegio de México. This is part of the seminar on migration, inequality and public policy. In Spanish, el Seminario de Migración, Desigualdad y políticas públicas. And the general idea of the seminar is to discuss the relationship between migration and inequality and how public policy in general, not only migration policy, can mediate these processes of inequality, but also help reduce inequality or even make inequality even larger. Philip Martin, he's emeritus professor of the University of California at Davis. He's in the Agriculture and Resource Economics Department, and he's the chair of the UC Comparative Immigration and Integration Program. Agustín Escobar Latapí is Director General of the Centro de Investigaciones Estudios Superiores en Antropología Social, and among different academic hats and hats in work in policymaking, he's also a consejero académico of the Coneval, the National Council of Evaluation of Social Policy. I mean, this will be shown later, but this is January 23rd. So both Phil and Agustín were participated in the panel that we had today in el Sistema Migratorio Regional de cara a la administración de Trump. So we don't know what Donald Trump is going to do. We don't know his policies. Where are we today in terms of migration policy? And specifically, I would like to know, how do you see these migration policies shaping inequality? We know that legal status has an impact.
Well, I mean, I can say from the point of view of the United States, we have roughly 43 million foreign-born residents of the United States. 26 million of them are in the U.S. labor force. So we have 14% foreign-born residents, 16% foreign-born workers. And the foreign-born, that is the immigrants, legal and unauthorized, differ from Americans in the sense that the foreign-born tend to have either very high levels of education or very low levels of education. So from the point of view of inequality, migration probably just from the demographics adds to inequality because you're adding to the very high-income people at the top and adding to the very low-income people at the bottom. That's just on the direct demographics. The indirect, that is, what impact immigrants have on U.S. workers, and do they displace Americans and all that sort of thing, I think there's probably less evidence of displacement, but it is true that the rate of return to capital, that is, the share of income going not to wages but to non-wages, has been going up. And migration could well be a very minor part of that. It could be technology, it could be trade, it could be tax policy, etc. So migration has some effect on inequality, but exactly what effect it has is very, very hard to tease out.
Well, in Mexico, things are changing. Mexicans' typical perception of a Mexican migrant abroad is that of a poor person who's very unskilled and is performing either farm jobs or very low-paid construction jobs. Mexican migrant workers in the U.S. used to conform to that picture very, very much for many years. But that has been changing slowly for the past 20 years. On the one hand, we have professionals who have left Mexico for the US or Canada or a few other countries, not much for Europe, but certainly the US and Canada, who have got either graduate degrees or postgraduate degrees and have gone to jobs abroad. And so the makeup of that population is changing. And on the other hand, we also have a number of people who left Mexico at a very young age and have been schooled in the United States and are returning to Mexico, the so-called dreamers, about which we had a meeting here last week. And that also makes the population much more complicated. When you look at the usual makeup of the Mexican population that's returning to Mexico, you find that they earn low jobs, they have farm jobs, and they have construction jobs in Mexico. But when you look at the new makeup, you're seeing a number of skilled persons who are either working abroad as Mexicans or have been returning to Mexico and expect something else from the Mexican labor market. So we tend to view, because of the traditional vision of migration, we tend to view migration as something that lessens inequality in Mexico, because it sends people from very low income families and sends remittances to very low income families. That wasn't always exactly the case. It was a bit more complicated than that. But right now, I would say it's even less the case. So you would have families in higher echelons of the Mexican income structure actually receiving remittances and receiving money from abroad. So the makeup or the contribution of migration to inequality is complicated. It's no longer, it's not just the bottom. It's got a distribution, and it may be actually increasing inequality. But families are paying much more for their children's education. So a child who sends back remittances after he or she has a job abroad is also paying back a loan, perhaps not a loan itself, but actually a social debt to his family. So the issue has become far more complicated, with reverse remittances for education, remittances from the children, and the contribution to inequality is less clear than what it was before.
Yeah, and I mean, this comes to the whole idea of the association between poverty and migration, and I mean, it's never as linear as we think. One of the things that we discussed today in the morning in the seminar was, and this is something you mentioned, Phil, that 30 years ago, people from many different sides of the migration spectrum, for or against guest foreign workers or temporary workers programs or even legalization programs, were all sitting at the same table discussing, and that we right now we have a polarization that has split these different actors that could dialogue in terms of what's going to happen. So you both have lots of experience in terms of establishing binational dialogues in the US and Mexico, trying to figure out and sitting people in the table with facts and evidence. So you were a little bit more pessimistic in the sense that today facts and evidence, empirical evidence, will not have an impact. In Mexico, we would like to stay a little bit more optimistic and think that actually this evidence might actually have a tell in the story. But how do you see this dialogue coming in a sense where when we see that, I mean, within inequality it's complex, but trying to talk to different actors that are not sitting in the table today, what do you think would happen? But also, how do we bring the experience that the different binational dialogues have had in trying to establish this dialogue?
Well, if we go back and remember how migration policy or migration between Mexico and the U.S. evolved and how the Binational Commission came about, remember in the early 1980s, there were somewhere between 3 and 4 million unauthorized foreigners in the United States. And at that time, there was a debate over which was most important. Was it most important to pass laws to prevent further illegal migration, as it was called then, or to legalize people who had established roots in the United States? And the grand compromise was some of both, more enforcement and legalization. What happened is that the legalization part worked, and probably worked too well in the case of the farm worker programs. The enforcement did not function the way it was expected. And so Mexico-US migration increased rather than decreasing, and California in the early 1990s went through its worst recession in 50 years. And yet Mexicans were still coming. That set the stage for Proposition 187, which would have been a very drastic curbing of the access of unauthorized foreigners to public services, including education. And even though a majority of Californians voted for it, it was really mostly never implemented. But because there were so many numbers thrown around about numbers and impacts and what to do, that set the stage for the Binational Commission in the late 1990s to say, let's see if we can get some agreement on numbers and impacts and what to do. And I think it was a useful exercise. We did come up with methodologies to get better numbers. We probably showed that the exaggerated assertions about impacts were in fact exaggerated. I don't know that we necessarily laid a good blueprint for recommendations, but the dialogue showed that you can have academics coming to consensus or narrowing differences on data and on impacts, but maybe the way to move forward in policy, of course, is influenced by events. And when 9/11 happened, the emphasis shifted away from labor migration and towards security concerns. And now we're at a stage where there has not been a great deal of bilateral dialogue or regional dialogue. There have been lots of think pieces put out showing that in North America or in the NAFTA countries, we've integrated particular markets. Automobiles come to mind between Canada, United States, and Mexico. They're relatively integrated markets. But we haven't had a great deal of discussion of the integration of labor markets. We can argue about how much they are integrated, how much they should be. But I think the main message that research would agree on is if you think of migration in the North American context as having a hump, first going up and then going down, the Mexico-US migration hump is on the way down. Nobody expects ever again to see the scale of migration that we had between 2000 and 2005, when 500,000 Mexicans a year moved to the US. When it comes to the Northern Triangle countries, we're probably on the upside of the migration hump. What we don't know is we don't know what the new Trump administration will wind up doing, whether its emphasis will be on security in the context of Muslim refugees, whether it's going to be on fences or walls at the border, whether it's going to be on criminals in the United States. So I think that the approach of the new administration is going to be to take steps which were discussed by the candidate in the campaign, but there has not been, as I understand it, a lot of binational dialogue recently at the political level in the last administration. And whether there will, we could have this paradox of more intergovernmental dialogue under the new president than we had under the last. I don't know. But we are entering a new era in which there will be, it's a pendulum swing, there will be a pendulum now to talk about enforcement, probably less talk about legalization. So that's the new period that we're in. It's not yet clear to me where that will come out.
Mexico was forcibly weaned from oil production and oil exports and oil resources during the past 8 or 10 years. That happened partly as a result of policy, because there was very little investment in new exploration, in probably in new forms of industrialization based on our own oil. But it is also partly history, I think. The international prices of oil went down. Mexico couldn't do much about that. And also the yield in most of our oil fields went down. So we were forcibly weaned from it. The question is whether now we should wean ourselves from migration. Many experts, including myself, have pointed out for the past 10, 15 years that our dependence on migration and on remittances who's growing,
Mhm.
and that many households, probably more than 1 million households, though it seems that less than 2 million households, depended very significantly on these remittances, and that was potentially a very dangerous thing for Mexico. I think the time has come in which we see that it is actually dangerous. And what we should do, basically, is be ready to not depend on migration. I think asking for wider or more migration, wider avenues for migration or more migration to the United States is a mistake. And I think that replacing migration with local employment, whatever we can find soon, is extremely important. But also that managing the return of people who might be, or probably will be, returned from the US to Mexico is a priority. But never again should we allow the growth of undocumented migration like we did for the past 70 years. In 1957, I think it was, when the Bracero program was being renewed, the US government allowed wetbacks, people who swam across the river, to be dried at the other end and to get a working permit very easily. The Mexican government realized that was very dangerous and tried to stop them, but that was only symbolic. I think now we really have to ask ourselves if we can continue undocumented migration to go on like it did in the past. I think the fact is obvious before our eyes. We can never again let that happen.
So this is super interesting because I think both your comments go towards looking inside differently, right? So because, I mean, in the case of Mexico, you're talking about controlling immigration, providing opportunities for Mexicans in Mexico, providing opportunities of returnees and immigrants in Mexico. And at the same time, you discussed more so in the morning about the role of local governments, the local state governments, and other actors that are not only the federal government. So let me ask you two things. First of all, a brief comment about symbolism in policies, because you mentioned right now, let's move away from symbolic policies. But also, I mean, several of us have suggested and recommended an increase of guest worker programs, flexibilization of TN visas, trying to figure out legal mechanisms for migration that move us away from this large undocumented flow. If you have to decide on priorities, I guess you both agree that Mexico needs to provide these opportunities, but we also need to establish a dialogue with the United States and Canada and other actors that are right now affecting or have an impact in our populations abroad, right? So in terms of priorities, how would you go on to trying to figure out what to do now? I mean, because many of our recommendations might not be as well received as we thought they could have been received before, right? So I don't know if you can comment on those two things about the fact that, yes, we know that the numbers show that we don't need a wall, right? The wall might have been useful 30 years ago, but we don't need a wall right now. But the symbol of the wall is there. So what to do next? Should we push forward?
Well, what I think the Trump administration will do is to add some amount of fencing or wall, if you like, on the border, and add some amount of Border Patrol policemen, which could wind up being mostly symbolic. I think what Mexico should anticipate is the return of more, especially people convicted of U.S. crimes, and think about how those people will be received back in Mexico. If the Trump administration were to go ahead and put in place more mechanisms to enforce immigration laws within the United States, remember 8 million unauthorized workers, roughly 5% of the U.S. workforce, is not authorized to be there, and they're about half Mexican. If those people were somehow shut out of the U.S. labor market, then the question would be, could they become legalized as temporary guest workers within the U.S., or would they first have to leave and return with some kind of a guest worker visa? It's in the context of accepting, dealing with the return of criminals, which is always hard for a country, and either legalizing the unauthorized workers abroad in some fashion, or perhaps opening more channels for guest workers. But it's looked at from, I think, a U.S. point of view. The demographics and economics of Mexico don't promise a huge outsurge anytime soon. So what it is managing sort of the downward part of a migration hump. There's still people willing to go, and figuring out what to do, how to protect, from the Mexican point of view, the rights of Mexicans in the U.S., but at the same time anticipating a return of at least a certain number of the Mexicans in the U.S. We already talked about children born in the U.S. to Mexican parents who are coming back. I don't know how, there's a lot of moving parts there, and it's difficult to see exactly how they will come together, but I do think something around the acceptance. I mean, Mexico has always taken back criminals, whereas, one of the reasons for the change in Cuba policy was now Cuba will accept the return of Cubans convicted of crimes in the United States as a result of the U.S. changing the wet foot, dry foot policy. So I think we will see a big push on the criminal foreigner front, and whether that will be coupled with something on the guest worker part is still not yet clear to me.
I think we should concentrate on the practicalities. And as I said before, I don't think a wall or an extension of the current fencing efforts. There's places where you have 3 fences or 2 walls and a fence. Is something that will change policy terribly. We already have it in the most visible parts of the border. The only parts that don't have it are parts that nobody sees, because they're in the middle of the desert. And so I think promising the wall on Trump's part is a very symbolic act, one that addresses the vulnerability perceived by American workers, by US workers specifically, but that will not, something that will not change the practicalities of labor flows and employment in either of the 2 countries. What I think that we do need to concentrate on is in making sure that the border works for us. We have avoided using the border for our national interest for a long, long time. There has been tremendous growth in imports or temporary imports for export along the border, but we have not really made a significant effort to control, for example, the import of guns, or we have not made a significant effort to stop people who have committed criminal acts in Mexico from returning to Mexico with no consequence. We have to make sure that we know who's coming in, and that we can stop people who we do not want. This is something that a normal country does, and we have not done when it comes to the United States. So I think the practicalities of migration have a lot more to do with this than with being offended by somebody whom we called a friend and doesn't seem to be one. International relations can become tense. This is not about friendship. This is not about trust. This is about what you can do to influence your future in the best way possible. And I think concentrating on the wall is probably the worst idea.
We need to close this discussion today, but I would give you one last minute to say a few words about, in general, what would happen if we don't have policies that aim to reduce inequality? This may sound obvious, right? But where should we put the focus? And just very few brief comments.
I think the goal of North America, the goal of the world, is a world of very few barriers between nation states, but relatively little unwanted movement over those borders. And the way to get to that idealistic place is to level up, that is, to have the poorer countries get richer, so you get to a European Union type situation where you lower barriers precisely because not many people move. And I think the challenge in North America between, let's say, Mexico and the United States is there has been a lot of integration, and yet there's still significant inequalities, not perhaps as severe as what they once were, but it's some way of leveling up and narrowing those differences, which in turn then can make that border a much less intimidating place. It doesn't have to be all the talk of walls and all that sort of thing if we can do some leveling up between countries.
I think I saw a paper you did which mentioned that in the 1980s or in 1980, the gap between per capita income in the rich countries and the poor countries was about 20-1. And that gap increased by 2010 to about 60-1, which makes you beg the question of why do people migrate.
Yeah.
Certainly people migrate for other reasons, but that is one very significant reason why people migrate. And I think that a form of development that is using poor countries as resource banks or resource vessels and nothing else, and is really paying no attention to local development, is the one that has brought us to this position. Inequality between countries grew, we had more migration pressure, and now we have a big pushback from electorates in richer countries saying we don't want the migrants anymore, and that's becoming very systematic. But we need to understand that inequality is at the source of what happened, and also inequality within rich countries, because it's people who feel that they're losing relative to others who protest the harder or the loudest. And so inequality is closely related to what's happening to migration, and it's not an easy fix.
Right.
This is probably the next major change in world economic history, but it's not happening yet.
Well, thank you very much for the discussion. I want to say I'm really happy that Colegio de la Frontera Norte, el CIDE, CIESAS y el Colegio de México put together the efforts of the event that we had today to actually bring Phil Martin and Agustín and have them here. And I thank CIESAS because you took the lead in the organization of the event today. And thank you, Phil, and thank you, Agustín, for this interesting talk. And then hopefully we'll have more discussions on inequality, migration, and public policy in the next videos. That we'll have.
Thank you very much.